So on Monday, we began our study of Judaism, the first of three religions that we'll be exploring that originated in the Middle East. And as I explained in the first lecture, by studying Judaism over 5 lectures, we're actually going to be learning a good deal about Christianity and Islam in the process, because both of those religions have their roots within Judaism. And in my first lecture, after introducing you to this ancient Middle Eastern tribal confederation known as the Israelites, we then turned to a set of texts that later Israelite scribes would compose, chiefly between the 6th and 4th century BCE. And that collection of texts is known as the Torah. So we were going through the narratives of the Torah. And the most important figure within the Torah is the great prophet Moses. And Moses, of course, is a very important figure, not only for Judaism, but also in Christianity and Islam as well. So we're going to pick up where we left off in our discussion of Moses last time, and then we're going to move beyond Moses. We'll talk about what happens in the period after him. In the second section of the sacred Jewish text, we'll turn to a collection of books called the Nevi'im, which means the prophets, which comes after the Torah within the Hebrew Bible, or what's known as the Tanakh. All right, so I'm the only one in here, so I'm actually going to take my mask off and make it a little bit easier on myself. Won't fog my glasses up as much to lecture, and if someone does happen to show up late, I can go ahead and put that back on. So last time, we were introduced to this figure called Moses, and that Moses is regarded as the greatest prophet in Judaism. What do I mean by a prophet? Well, a prophet isn't someone who sees the future. A prophet, in this context, and in the context of Christianity and Islam as well, is a human being who is chosen by a god, a deity, as a messenger, someone who receives instructions, someone who receives knowledge from the deity, and then that messenger, that prophet, then either needs to carry out specific instructions or to communicate a message to other people. So at the end of the lecture last time, Moses had been in the wilderness in the land of Midian, which is in what is now northwestern Saudi Arabia. He's in the wilderness where he sees this curious sight. It's a burning bush, and there's no storm, there's no lightning, there's no one else around. So he's curious as to why this bush is burning in the middle of nowhere, and he goes to investigate, and suddenly this divine voice speaks to him out of the burning bush. And this is the voice of none other than the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the 3 patriarchs that we learned about from our discussion of the Torah last time, these great male ancestors of the Israelites, that tribal confederation that we began the lecture with last time. So the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who is called Yahweh, commands Moses to go back to Egypt and command the ruler there, the king there, the Pharaoh, to release all the Israelites who are in bondage there. And Moses is reluctant, but he ultimately obeys. He goes with his brother Aaron, who's also appointed as a prophet, as a kind of co-prophet with Moses. They go back to Egypt. They confront Pharaoh. Pharaoh is not interested in listening to what Moses and Aaron have to say. He's very stubborn. He's arrogant. He doesn't believe in the God of Abraham. He thinks that he's a god. And so Yahweh then unleashes these plagues, these disasters on Egypt that culminate with the death of the firstborn. And so Pharaoh loses his own son, as do all the other people of Egypt. And with that, finally, he relents, and the Israelites are allowed to leave Egypt. However, he quickly changes his mind and pursues the Israelites through the desert as they head east into the Sinai. And that is where we have this great miracle of Moses parting the sea. He raises his staff, and the waters of the sea separate, which in the popular imagination has become the Red Sea, although that's not actually in the Hebrew text itself, which is that big, deep, cavernous sea that separates the Arabian Peninsula from Egypt. And they're able to cross. When the Egyptians attempt to pursue them there, the waters close in on them and they drown. And so the Israelites, led by Moses and Aaron, have escaped. And this event is called the Exodus. The Exodus is this tremendously important narrative in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam as well. And so many people look to that narrative as something to inspire them in their own struggle for freedom and liberation from oppression. So after having led the Israelites out of bondage into the Sinai Peninsula, and this is the Sinai Peninsula here, you can see, Moses has this great encounter with Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Moses goes up a mountain. And the idea of a mountain as a meeting place between human beings and the divine is something that we see again and again in different religious traditions. And why is that? Well, the sky, the heavens above, are often associated with the divine, with heavenly beings and so forth. And prior to modern architecture, where we have massive skyscrapers and so forth, mountains were the tallest structures on earth. And so what better place to go and meet with these beings that reside in the sky, in the heavens above us, than on top of a mountain? So again and again in different religious traditions, we see these encounters taking place on mountains. And that's where Moses goes. He goes up Mount Sinai. The exact location of Mount Sinai, we don't know. If you go to Egypt today, they'll point you to a particular mountain and say that's Mount Sinai, but that's a modern identification. We don't know what mountain the authors were actually thinking of when they composed this narrative. And it's there on top of the mountain that Moses receives new terms, additional terms to this special arrangement that exists between Yahweh and the Israelites, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We talked last time about a special arrangement that had existed between Abraham and his God, and that a sign for that arrangement or covenant was male circumcision. Well, now Moses up atop the mountain is receiving new terms, additional terms that the Israelites need to follow, that they need to obey. And he receives 10 of those instructions on stone tablets, the tablets of the law that we would come to know as the 10 Commandments. But the tradition is that he actually receives the entirety of the Torah, right? I've been telling you stories from the Torah. The traditional belief, and the belief that still exists in Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox Judaism, is that Moses receives the entirety of the Torah from God on Sinai, and then Moses then writes it down. But what he carries down to the Israelites waiting at the base of the mountain are these 2 stone tablets that have inscribed on them the 10 Commandments. So what are the 10 Commandments? Well, I've paraphrased them here from how they are enumerated in the book of Exodus, one of the 5 books of the Torah. The first one states, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me." Now, I mentioned last time that ancient Israelite religion, the earliest formulations of Judaism, it probably wasn't monotheistic. It was monolatrous, perhaps, at times polytheistic, but monolatry meaning that you worship one God. Other people have their gods. We, the Israelites, have our God, and we're only going to worship them. And you can see in the phrasing of the first commandment that monolatrous legacy, right? It doesn't say there's only one God or there are no other gods. It says, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me." That's a curious phrasing. And in elsewhere, it describes the God of the Israelites, Yahweh, as being a jealous God. But subsequently, this would come to be understood as a statement of monotheism, right? That there's one God, and that would be a core component of not only Judaism, but subsequently Christianity, albeit in a Trinitarian form, and then Islam as well. The second commandment, "Thou shalt not make for yourself an image and worship them." So no idolatry. I mentioned one of the distinctive things about the ancient Israelites is that in contrast to all the other peoples of the ancient Middle East, when it came to their deity, they didn't actually depict their deity in a statue. Right? They didn't engrave any kind of monumental statue of Yahweh to worship the way the Greeks would carve statues of Zeus, or the Egyptians would carve statues of Horus or Anubis or another deity, and so on. The Israelites didn't do that. They rejected the idea of idolatry. Number 3, thou shalt not misuse the name of God. Right? Don't take the Lord's name in vain. That's another way of rendering this commandment. And so among devout Jews, in order to avoid even accidentally using the Lord's name in vain, they'll avoid saying not only the most sacred name, which is Yahweh, but even an alternative like El Shaddai or Elohim or Eloah, or even the English word God. And so one substitute that is used in Orthodox Judaism is to say Hashem instead of saying God or Yahweh. What does Hashem means? Ha is the definite article, it means the, and Shem means name. So it literally means the name. So instead of saying God, you would say Hashem, the name, in order to avoid actually saying God's name and using it in an improper context. Number 4, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. In my lecture on Monday, I told you the creation myth as it's articulated in the first book of the Torah, what we refer to in English as the book of Genesis. And in that narrative, the universe as we know it unfolds and it is created over a span of what's described as 6 days. And so the 7th day, the Torah says, is the day that God rests after completing the creation. Well, the Israelites are expected to observe that day as a day of rest as well and refrain from doing any form of work on that day. This is a solemn, sacred day devoted to the Lord and should not be used for other business. Now, what day of the week is the Sabbath? It's Saturday. It's not Sunday. That's the Christian Sabbath. In Judaism, the Sabbath, where the idea of the Sabbath originated, right before Christianity ever existed, the Sabbath begins when the sun sets on Friday and it continues until the sun sets on Saturday. So in terms of daylight hours, the Jewish Sabbath is Saturday, but nights precede the day in the Jewish reckoning of time, when we're talking about a liturgical calendar for the determination of sacred days and so forth. The Sabbath would begin when the sun sets on Friday and it goes until the sun sets on Saturday. Now, Christianity, unless you're a Seventh-day Adventist and maybe a few other small Christian denominations, the Sabbath becomes Sunday. Why? Because the belief is from the Christian New Testament that Jesus rises from the dead on a Sunday, and so that becomes the Lord's Day in Christianity. Number 5, honor your father and mother. Honor your parents. In fact, this is such a big deal that if you read, there's another passage in the Torah that specifies that those who dishonor their parents should be stoned to death. That's how serious it is to honor your parents. 6 through 10, don't commit murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't lie, don't covet your neighbor's property. Right? Those are the 10 commandments. But there's a lot more to the covenant that exists between the Israelites and Yahweh, the God of Abraham. And we'll see subsequent Jewish scholars interpret the Torah and derive from the Torah a collection of 613 commandments, not just 10, 603 more in addition to these that devout Jews are expected to adhere to. We'll talk about that in the 3rd lecture on Judaism when we explore Jewish practice in more detail. So having brought those commandments down from the mountain on stone tablets, the Torah says that initially when Moses came down, he found that the Israelites had built a false idol, the golden calf, and gone astray. And he actually has to have the righteous Israelites kill all the idol-worshiping Israelites. So after the killing is done, these stone tablets that he had initially destroyed when he found the golden calf, he has new tablets created, and then they're installed in this sacred vessel, which is called the Ark of the Covenant. The covenant, again, being the special agreement, the special arrangement that exists between the God of Abraham, Yahweh, and the Israelites, this particular tribal confederation descended from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So this golden vessel contains the tablets of the law, and it's portable. And at this time, the Torah says the Israelites have not settled. They're wandering through the desert. They're wandering in the Sinai, but they're headed for the land that was promised to Abraham and his descendants, according to the story of Abraham, which is the land of Canaan. And as they move, they have this portable temple that houses the Ark of the Covenant. And it's a tent-like structure that contains an inner sanctuary where only the priest can enter, and that's where the Ark is kept. And the space where the Ark exists is the Holy of Holies. And then an outer courtyard where there is a basin for ritual washing to purify yourself. And there is also a sacrificial altar where you sacrifice animals, that the blood of animals atones for sins, for acts of disobedience. And the animal carcasses can also be burned as well. And there's a great deal of information about animal sacrifice in the Torah. For example, the sacrifice of a red heifer is found in Numbers chapter, I believe, 19 as one of the commandments that the Israelites have to follow. Now, Moses himself never makes it out of the Sinai. We're told that he dies in the Sinai in an unknown location. And so it's only after him that the Israelites would settle in the land of Canaan. Once you get to the death of Moses, you've reached the end of the Torah. So those 5 books of the Torah come to an end. And the last passage of the Torah in the book of Deuteronomy talks about the greatness of Moses. And once you've completed that, then you move to a new collection of books. And that next collection of books is called the Nevi'im. You can see there. So the word Nevi'im in Hebrew means prophets. Navi is prophet singular. And the first book of the prophets is the book of Joshua, which talks about the Israelite conquest of Canaan. So according to this narrative, the Israelites invade and they defeat the existing inhabitants of Canaan, which gives you the sense that the Israelites are outsiders conquering the indigenous people of Canaan. But as I said at the beginning of my first lecture, the conclusion of contemporary scholars and of archaeologists is that this narrative is a later invention, that the reality is that the ancient Israelites were always Canaanites, that they didn't invade Canaan from Egypt or anywhere else, that they rebelled against an aristocratic oppressive system that was already on the decline and then forged a new society, a new egalitarian society. And in crafting a separate identity, they developed these narratives, the narratives of the Exodus, the narratives of Moses, the narrative of the conquest under Joshua. So I want to move forward a bit within this collection of books called the Nevi'im and get to the period of the monarchy. So the Israelites in the land of Canaan, who we now call Israel and Palestine, established a system of government for themselves. And the system that they adopt is a monarchy. So they live under the rule of kings. And the first king, according to the Nevi'im, is a man called Saul. And Saul rules at a time when the Israelites are just sort of establishing themselves and they are engaged in battles against neighboring peoples, chief amongst them the Philistines, who live in southwestern Canaan, in what we now call Gaza. And there's the Nevi'im is full of stories of battles with all these rival peoples. And so you really get the sense of Yahweh as a kind of God of war in this period of the Hebrew scriptures. But in time, Saul loses the favor of Yahweh. To borrow a phrase from our study of East Asian religions, he loses the mandate of heaven, right? The heaven is no longer on his side, and so he dies in battle along with his son. And so then there is a dispute over who should succeed him as king. A significant number of the Israelites support another one of Saul's sons, but other people, especially from the tribe of Judah, support this charismatic young warrior named David. And David will rise to ultimately triumph and become the next king of Israel, defeating Saul's other son. He initially has his capital in the city of Hebron, but thereafter he conquers a Canaanite city we know as Jerusalem and makes that his capital. So King David is celebrated in the Jewish tradition as the archetypal Jewish king, the paradigm for Jewish rule. that he ruled in a kind of golden age in which the ancient Jewish kingdom, the kingdom of Israel, was at its peak. It was united, it was strong and powerful, fending off its foes, having conquered the holy city of Jerusalem, that this was really a time of celebration and greatness. And David, in addition to being a king and a great warrior, is also regarded as a prophet. And Jewish tradition says that it was David who composed a book that we find in the Jewish scriptures, the book of Psalms, and that he had once sung those hymns, not only to God, but even to soothe the ailing Saul, who was often a very troubled man. So what do we know about David? Well, as a historical figure, we know virtually nothing about David. And for a long time, scholars thought that David was a purely mythical king, the way King Arthur is a mythical king in British legend and folklore. But archaeologists have found at least one artifact that contains a reference to the house of David. And so based on that, people have reconsidered and thought that, well, okay, perhaps there was an Israelite king named David at one point who began this royal line, the house of David. We don't have any other evidence to support the narratives that we have in the Bible. So the information I'm sharing with you here is that which is composed by later Jewish scribes in the Jewish scriptures, not an independent historical account of his life. So the Hebrew Bible tells us that David was born in the city of Bethlehem, and he lived during a time in which the greatest prophet of the Israelites was Samuel, and he becomes king after this period of civil war after the death of Saul at the age of 30. Now, when Saul became king and when David became king, there was a coronation ceremony where the Israelite priests would hold a ceremony officially recognizing Saul or David's successor Solomon as the new king, like a swearing in, right? Like when you take your oath of office. And part of this ceremony involved anointing the new king with sacred oil. And so because the king of the Israelites, the king of the Jews, was anointed with this sacred oil, one of the titles for the kings of Israel was Mashiach, which means anointed one. We know this term in its English rendering as Messiah. So the English word Messiah doesn't actually literally mean savior or divine being. It literally means anointed one, coming from the Hebrew word Mashiach. And it was a reference to the kings of Israel. So David was a Mashiach. He was a Messiah. He was an anointed one of Yahweh. And among the other honorary titles held by the kings of Israel was the title of Son of God, Son of Yahweh, Son of Hashem. That the king of the Israelites was the earthly intermediary between God and the people. Not completely unlike the way, the emperor of China was the son of Tian, the intermediary between Tian, heaven, and earth. We see a similar configuration here. Under David's rule, he leads the Israelite armies to the conquest of the city of Jerusalem. Right? Jerusalem already existed as a settlement, and it's in Jerusalem where there's a hill called Zion. Right? So you hear, if you listen to Bob Marley lyrics or something like that, right? You hear references to Zion. That is in reference to Jerusalem. And as the Hebrew Bible itself says, the city thereafter becomes known as the city of David. Right? It becomes the capital of Israel. Hebron had been the capital previously. And despite his successes and that he is this anointed king serving Yahweh, his reign is full of turmoil according to the Jewish scriptures. He gets himself in all kinds of trouble, but because of Yahweh's love for David, his reign does continue. He is not stripped of his throne the way that Saul was. Now, later on in the lecture today, I'll talk about, assuming I don't run out of time, the end of the line of the house of David, that David's royal dynasty comes to an end, and thereafter, Jewish thinkers, scholars, scribes would begin to think about the restoration of the royal bloodline of David, of a new line of kings. And so they came to await the coming of a new anointed one, a new Mashiach, a new Messiah. And that remains a core part of Judaism to this day, that the Jewish people are awaiting the coming of a new king from the house of David, from the line of David. So they're awaiting the coming of the Mashiach. Now, throughout Jewish history, there have been various people who were either identified or claimed to be the awaited Mashiach. One of those was a preacher from the Galilee, from the town of Nazareth, named Yeshua. We call Yeshua in English Jesus, which is a rendering of the Greek formulation of his name, Jesus, but his name was Yeshua. And that would be the starting point for the next religion we'll study, that's Christianity. But sticking with Judaism, David is succeeded by his son Solomon. Now, David was a polygamist, had lots of children, lots of wives and concubines, but it's Solomon who ends up being his successor. And Solomon, too, is a polygamist, lots of wives, lots of children. And Solomon is celebrated in the Jewish scripture for being a man of exceptional wisdom. And the idea of Solomon's wisdom and the extent of it would capture the imagination of later writers who would even imagine Solomon having knowledge of the occult and magic and all of these interesting things. Well, it's Solomon who, in the city of David, in Jerusalem, constructs a permanent temple to house the Ark of the Covenant in Jerusalem. This replaces the earlier tabernacle that I showed you, that tent-like structure that was portable in the Sinai. So now Jerusalem is home to this great stone temple, the Temple of Solomon, devoted to the God of the Israelites, Yahweh. Now, the temple does not exist anymore, but this is what it's thought to have looked like based on the descriptions of it. So we have this outer courtyard and then this inner sanctuary, and it's in this inner sanctuary that we have what's called the Holy of Holies, the most sacred spot on earth for the Jewish people, for the Israelites, and that is where the Ark of the Covenant, that golden vessel that is said to contain the tablets of the law given to the great prophet Moses at Sinai. So what goes on at the temple? Well, here is where the priests perform the various rituals in honor of Yahweh. Chief amongst them, they perform ritual animal sacrifices. So in order to atone for acts of disobedience, for sins by the Israelites, the Israelite priests regularly have to perform animal sacrifices. That blood atones for sin. And so this involves the sacrifice of sheep and rams and cows, bulls, even things like doves as well. And individuals can make offerings, but the priests make the most important offerings there. So this whole idea that in order to atone for sin, you sacrifice an animal, and the blood atones for sin, is something that's important for us to remember, because later on when we study Christianity, Christians believe that there was a blood sacrifice to atone for sin, but it wasn't an animal this time. It was this Messiah who was in fact a human incarnation of God, specifically God the Son, one of the three persons of the Christian Holy Trinity, and that he dies as an atoning sacrifice for the sins of humanity on the cross, the sacrifice to end all sacrifices, right? And that his blood atoned for that sin. And there's a Christian ritual, the Eucharist or communion, in which Christians will commemorate this sacrifice by drinking wine, which is understood to be the blood of Christ. So that whole notion of blood as atoning for sin is rooted in the animal sacrifices of the temple. Now, during the reign of Solomon, because he married so many women, he married some foreign women as well. And those foreign women brought with them their foreign gods. And so it was under the reign of Solomon, the Hebrew Bible says, that foreign gods were introduced into the Holy Temple, into the city of David, into Jerusalem. And as we saw, the first commandment of the 10 commandments was, thou shalt have no other gods before me. And then if you keep going, it says, no graven images either. Well, Solomon had just allowed these blatant violations of those commandments. And so as punishment, after Solomon dies, Yahweh, we're told, allows the united kingdom of Israel that had existed under David and Solomon to be split into two. And so we see the formation of two separate Israelite or Jewish kingdoms In the north, we have the kingdom of Israel with its capital at Samaria. And then we have the kingdom of Judah to the south with its capital at Jerusalem, where the temple to Yahweh exists. Now, obviously, the name of the religion we're talking about today, which we began to study on Monday, is Judaism, which derives from Judah. It's not called Israelism. So the reason why that is because in the 8th century BCE, the Assyrians from over here invade, conquer, and destroy the northern kingdom. So it ceases to exist. That means that the only Jewish kingdom left is the kingdom of Judah. And thus we would end up getting this religion of the Judeans, Judaism. So the kingdom of Judah, this small kingdom in a precarious position, continues to exist up until the 6th century BCE, when another enormously important event occurs. This is called the Babylonian exile, also called the Babylonian captivity. Why is it called that? Well, because the Babylonian Empire to the east, coming from what is now Iraq, conquers the Assyrians and comes in and conquers the kingdom of Judah as well. This is a huge event because this is going to mark a dramatic change in the direction of Israelite religion towards what we would recognize as Judaism today. Well, what happened? What were the changes that occurred? When the Babylonians come in, they destroy the Temple of Solomon, the sacred temple that houses the Ark of the Covenant, the most sacred place on earth. The temple devoted to Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, is destroyed. These polytheistic Babylonians come in and they destroy it, tear it down. That's out of the way. Then they kill the princes of Judah. They blind the king of Judah from the house of David, and they take him back as prisoner, and he dies in exile. Suddenly the monarchy's gone, right? No temple to Yahweh, no monarchy anymore. They take the priests, the scribes, all the elders of the community as prisoner and take them back to Babylon, to Mesopotamia, to Iraq. And so now the Israelites have to figure out where do we go from here? This could have been the end. Right? They've lost the temple. They've lost the monarchy. What do we do now? How do we worship Yahweh if we don't have the temple? We can't perform the sacrifices and all those things. So it's at this critical point that the Israelites have to figure out how to go forward and adapt to new circumstances, new challenges. And the result is ultimately going to be Judaism as we know it. So here's a map showing the Babylonian Empire at the time of the captivity or the exile in the 6th century BCE. Here you can see Judah. The red dot here marks Jerusalem, conquered by the Babylonians. And over here is Babylon. And the reason why the term Babylon would come to be associated with evil and wickedness is because of this event. Right? The Babylonians are these polytheistic foreigners, these pagans who don't live according to the true teachings of the prophets and the Torah. And they've just conquered God's holy temple, plundered it, and taken God's chosen people, the Israelites, back in bondage, in captivity. And so Babylon comes to be referred, as the abode of devils, the city of evil, and so forth. So for those who are living in exile, we have these priests, we have these scribes, we have these chieftains, these Jewish elders, now living in Babylon, in exile. There's no temple. There's no way to perform the sacrifices to Yahweh. They can no longer practice their religion the way they used to. So they have to adapt. And so it's during the Babylonian exile or Babylonian captivity in the 6th century BCE, which, by the way, is also the time in which, to the east, we have the Buddha, we have Mahavir, we have Confucius, we have Lao Tzu. This is a critical period in the history of religion around the world. The exiles then develop as a substitute for animal sacrifice and the traditional rites of the temple, the practice of prayer. We can't sacrifice the animals anymore to Yahweh at the temple, so what do? Well, we say sacred words of praise and worship to Yahweh as a substitute. So ritual prayer develops. And of course, ritual prayer will become a core part of Christianity and Islam later on. We see the rise of a class of elders who are respected on the basis of their knowledge of tradition and the stories of the Israelite ancestors, the stories that would be written in the Torah. And by the way, this is the period in which the Torah ends up being written. These elders who possess knowledge are the rabbis. Right? The word rabbi literally means my Lord, my master, and it's a title of respect and honor for someone who's learned. We also have the rise of assembly halls. So if you go and you want to learn from one of these elders, these teachers, or you want to gather and pray, where do you go? So they start gathering in these assembly halls, which would come to be known by the Greek name synagogues. There are other names as well, shul, bet, knesset, all these other things. But synagogue is the term that's most common in English. And so gathering to pray and worship Yahweh, worship Hashem in the synagogue becomes the central religious rite in lieu of sacrifices in the temple. And of course, this is also the time in this catastrophic environment, right, where it seems like the world has just ended practically, right? Everything has been turned over, that Jewish scribes feel the urgency to write down the oral traditions. And so they write down the story of Adam and Chava, Adam and Eve. They write down the stories of Noah and the great flood. They write down the stories of the great patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They write down the story of Moses and the Exodus. And so the Torah comes together as a cohesive text. So finally, this period of exile under these terrible Babylonians comes to an end when the Babylonian Empire is conquered by another empire coming from the east. That's the Persian Empire, established by Cyrus the Great. So Cyrus conquers the Babylonians, and unlike the Babylonians, here's Cyrus. Cyrus is tolerant. He says, hey, as long as you respect me as the leader, you can do your own thing. You can practice your own religion. You can have your own temples. You can enjoy a degree of autonomy within your communities. Just don't challenge me as the emperor, right? I'm the guy. I rule supreme. So as long as you don't challenge me, you can kind of do your thing. And so that's what Cyrus does. He says to the people that the Babylonians had conquered, you can all go home and resume your previous activities. So the Jewish exiles are allowed to return to Judea, return to what had been the kingdom of Judah, return to Jerusalem. And they begin to construct a new temple, what's called the Second Temple. Right? The first temple was the Temple of Solomon. That was destroyed by the Babylonians. Now in the Persian period, they can build a new temple. This is the Second Temple. And this is the temple that's going to exist all the way up until the year 70, when it's destroyed by the Romans. And there's been no temple since. But not everyone goes back. And you'd think, well, wait, why wouldn't everyone rush to go back? Well, because at the time, the Persian Empire, Babylon, this is the center of the world, center of Asia at least. And this is where all the latest knowledge is, all the latest technology, all the latest culture and arts, everything that's happening there. It would be like someone, kidnapping you from Trumansburg, New York, in upstate New York, which is a small town, it's where I went to high school, and then taking you to New York City. And you're forced to stay in New York City, and then eventually they say, okay, you can go back to Trumansburg now. And you go, well, I might stick around New York City because all kinds of stuff is going on here, and no disrespect to my hometown, but yeah, it's not as much as going on. So Judea, in places like Iraq and what we now call Iraq and Iran. Now, in the 20th century, the Iraqi Jewish community basically entirely migrates to the new state of Israel established in 1948. But there is still a small Jewish community in Iran today, somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 to 25,000. And it's said that that community goes all the way back to the time of the captivity or the exile. For those Jews who had interacted with Persian culture, Babylonian culture, it had an impact on how they thought about their own beliefs and their own practices. And this would also change the historical course of Judaism, and by extension, Christianity and Islam as well. That we see, for example, a new emphasis on the idea of an afterlife, one in which the good people go to a different place than the bad people. If you look at the Torah, there's no such thing. There's only Sheol. There's an underworld where everyone goes, good or bad. But after the Babylonian exile, the Babylonian captivity, where there's this interaction with this diverse culture of ideas and religions and so forth, we begin to see Judaism talking about a place for the righteous, those who are faithful to Yahweh, and a place for the wicked, a place of punishment. We also begin to see renewed emphasis on eschatology, that is the study of the end times, the future destruction of this world. If time is linear and it has a beginning, it has to have an end. And so what's going to happen at the end? So we begin to see greater articulation of end times, of Jewish eschatology. And of course, both of these pieces are going to be really richly developed when it comes to Christianity and Islam later on. The Persian period also marks the end of the Jewish line of prophets. So I mentioned that the second section in the Hebrew Bible and the Jewish scriptures is called the Nevi'im. Nevi'im means prophets. So there are lots of prophets. We've already talked about Moses. Abraham is a prophet. Noah is a prophet. I mentioned Samuel briefly. There are other prophets like Elijah, Daniel. There are many, many different prophets in the Jewish tradition. But Judaism no longer has prophets. That prophethood came to an end during the Persian period, the end of the 6th century BCE. And the prevailing view among the rabbis, the Jewish scholars, is that the last prophet was Malachi. And so with the end of prophethood, that means that all other figures in religious history who claim to be prophets are not recognized as prophets in Judaism. That means that Jesus of Nazareth, who lives in the 1st century during the Roman period, is not a prophet in Judaism. John the Baptist is not a prophet in Judaism. Muhammad is not a prophet in Judaism. Right? Prophethood ends hundreds of years before in Judaism with Malachi. So in the absence of Yahweh sending prophets to the Jewish people, to the Israelites, who becomes the new source of religious knowledge? The rabbis, the scholars of the text. So we have these scribes writing these texts like the Torah, and then we have learned people who are literate, who can read and study these texts and interpret them and provide people with information about how to apply the teachings of these writings to their life. What does Yahweh want us to do? How do we adhere to the terms of the covenant? Right? We are people who are bound by this covenant with the God of Abraham. What are the terms that we have to fulfill? What are we allowed to do and what are we forbidden to do? What foods can we eat and what can't we eat? How many times a day do we have to pray? How do we dress? All those things are laid out and interpreted by the rabbis, the Jewish scholars. And we'll talk much more about the rabbis on Friday when we look at rabbinic Judaism. So by this period, we have the Torah taking shape as a cohesive text. The Nevi'im is taking shape as a cohesive text. But there are some additional books as well. Collectively, all the Jewish sacred texts form what I've called many times today, the Hebrew Bible. But this is also called the Tanakh. So the word Tanakh is an acronym. It stands for Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, the 3 sections. Right? You can see my copy here. Tanakh, the Holy Scriptures, and there's the 3 sections in English and Hebrew, Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. So the first section, That's the section with the creation story and the story of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the story of Moses and the Exodus. And then Nevi'im, the prophets, this is where we have Joshua leading the Israelites into Canaan, and then we have the story of David and Solomon and all these other prophets. And then the last section, Ketuvim, this is the writings. This is the most diverse section of the Tanakh, of the Hebrew Bible. That's where, for example, we have a book called the Book of Job. And the Book of Job is about the problem of innocent suffering and evil. And it's in that book that we see for the first time a figure called Satan, the Ha-Satan, which means literally the adversary. And I mentioned the fact that Satan is never mentioned in the Torah. Satan's not in here. So that snake in the garden, that was never understood to be Satan early on. But by the time we get to this later period and we move into the Roman period, we see this clear association between that serpent and Satan. And that becomes a part of Christian belief and Muslim belief. In fact, if you read the Quran, which is the holy book of Islam, when it tells the story of Adam and Eve, it never mentions a serpent at all. It just talks about Satan. Satan tempting Eve, Satan tempting Adam. There's no serpent mentioned. So that gives you a sense of how complete that association would become. It's also in the Ketuvim that we find the Psalms, which I said are hymns attributed to King David. We find Proverbs, lots of other diverse writings. And so collectively, the Tanakh is the Bible for Judaism. It's the Hebrew Bible, and this is what Christians would come to call the Old Testament. Right? They have their own separate books, but they keep the Jewish scriptures and just add their new books called the New Testament on top of the Tanakh. So the Persian period comes to an end when the Greeks enter the scene. And the Greeks introduce Greco-Roman Hellenic culture. And we see, for example, the Tanakh translated from Hebrew into Greek in a text called the Septuagint. And it's that Greek translation that would become enormously influential. And it makes the teachings of the Jews accessible to non-Jews, to Gentiles throughout the Eastern Mediterranean world. And Greek would become such an influential language in Hellenic culture more broadly that once we get to the first century and this new Jewish messianic sect starts that would eventually become Christianity, what do the first Christians write their holy books in? Not Hebrew, not Aramaic. All of the earliest Christian writings are written in Greek. It's because Alexander the Great conquers the Middle East. He sweeps down into South Asia. He sweeps into Egypt. Hellenic culture pervades the Middle East and has a profound impact. And so the earliest Christian documents, those documents that would form the New Testament, the Gospels of Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, they're all written in Greek, not Hebrew, not Aramaic. And it's because of the legacy of the Greeks in the region. Now, the Greeks wanted to absorb the religions of the people they conquered. So one of the things that they would do is they would say, well, our supreme god is Zeus. And so as we conquer these different peoples, their supreme gods are just different forms of Zeus. So the Greeks tried to insist that Yahweh is actually just Zeus. And so in Jerusalem, the Greeks installed a statue of Zeus in the second temple, the temple of Yahweh in Jerusalem. And that kind of sacrilegious, idolatrous blasphemy helped to inspire a Jewish revolt against the Greeks. It's called the Maccabee Revolt. And for a time, there is a kind of semi-autonomous Jewish kingdom existing until they are eventually conquered by the Roman Republic. And of course, it's in the Roman period that you'll eventually have the birth of Christianity as this messianic movement. Here's the extent of the Greek Empire established by Alexander. The Greeks made it all the way down into the Indus River Valley, which we learned about in our study of Hinduism. And some Greeks adopted Buddhism. So there was a Greek Buddhist tradition at one point. It would die out. But in the aftermath of the Greek conquest, a new empire would arise in South Asia. That's the Mauryan Empire. And we know that the third emperor of the Mauryan Empire was Ashoka, who converts to Buddhism and sends his son Mahinda to Sri Lanka and so forth. So we can see all these different connections. But here we can see Jerusalem. And Alexander established an important coastal city in northern Egypt called Alexandria. Alexandria would later on become an important city in the history of Christianity as well. So today we've talked about the Jews living under various foreign conquerors. We had the Babylonians, well, we had the Assyrians for the northern kingdom, then we had the Babylonians, then we had the Persians, then we had the Greeks. So throughout this, the Jews have not had their own king. They haven't been an independent kingdom aside from the Maccabees who revolted. And so Jewish thinkers, scholars, the rabbis, begin to talk about how one day a descendant from King David, from the house of David, will reappear to restore the monarchy, and that Israel will reemerge as an independent kingdom. The temple will be, in all its glory, and a new era of righteousness and peace will pervade the world. And so this becomes a core article of belief for Jews, that one day a new anointed one, a new Mashiach or Messiah will come. And so Jews are still awaiting the coming of Messiahs. And as I mentioned, there have been various people who have either been identified or claimed to be a Messiah. Simon Bar Kokhba, for example, was a self-proclaimed Jewish Messiah who initially had great successes, and people thought that he must be the Messiah, but then he gets defeated ultimately. There, of course, was Yeshua, or Jesus of Nazareth, who dies after preaching for only 2 or 3 years by the Romans. And so this is a dangerous idea because it's tied into the notion of rebellion and revolt against foreign overlords as well. And so it becomes a very touchy subject, right? Yes, we're awaiting the coming of the Messiah, but we'll also have to be skeptical about anyone who claims to be a Messiah because it could bring disaster upon us, right? Anyone who rises up against the Romans or the Greeks or whoever might be crushed as a result. And so it's with that in mind that we'll better understand the origins of Christianity, why Jews were expecting a Messiah, but also why people would also not fully embrace someone who people are claiming is Messiah as well. All right, I'm all out of time. Thanks for tuning in, and I will see you on Friday.